All right. Thank you very much, Karen, and thanks Applied Radiology and everybody involved. It's great to, after RSNA and after Chicago, make sure that for those that have not been able to attend in all face-to-face situations, to also enlighten them with some of the things we are doing. And one of the, I would say, very important introductions for us as Philips MR was the introduction of the MR 7700. And the title on the slide, Unmatched Performance and Precision, will become more clear when we go through the slides. Because it's not just a message, it's something that we live up to, and actually hopefully will show you some beautiful examples. Like I said, my name is Frank Hoogenraad. I'm responsible for 3T in our portfolio. Now, I will talk basically about three different topics. I will talk first a little bit about how our gradient system underpinning both the Elysian and the 7700 series sort of had some of the key features, being able to produce the image quality that we are going to show to you. Because it's not just an image, but it actually comes back to a deep down design of the system, being able to get where we are today. But the second part is about how, apart from hardware, how we can be smart. And artificial intelligence, or AI, has been a very big word over the last 2 years or so, and for good reasons. However, there's many different ways how one can apply AI. And I think the AI that we will show you, and has partly already been shown yesterday, is about how we apply it into reconstructions, allowing us to further accelerate and get to image qualities, enhancing what we can already do with from a hardware perspective. The two combined actually is what the true imaging is all about. And the third topic is a little bit for the curious minds among us, for those clinicians that drive beyond what is daily practice today, but which will give us a horizon, being able to discover different types of metabolic challenges or oncology physiological ideas. So we're going to talk about that in the coming 25 minutes, and make sure that you write down your questions so we can fill in the gaps afterwards. All right, without further ado, if we quickly look at our portfolio, and of course, I'm responsible for the 3T portfolio, and within 3T, we basically have three configurations that matter: the Elysian S, the Elysian X, and the latest configuration, which is the MR 7700. We all call them smart connected imaging systems for multiple reasons. But what the three systems have in common is the basic approach to gradient architecture. And it's true that all three systems bring a different level of performance, for good reasons as well. But even the Elysian S, which is our, I would say, lowest positioned or lowest priced configuration, is already able to provide beautiful imaging. However, for those that have an extreme requirement when it comes to diffusion or neuroscience, or maybe in the area of oncology, typically they will strongly prefer the higher end 7700. We will focus on the latter and move to the next slide for that reason. Now, a few moments on gradients. Gradients is both an interesting but also can be a complex topic. And for the last maybe 1 or 2 decades, when it comes to defining performance in an MR system, it has often been the gradient numbers of amplitude and slew rate. And I think maybe in the early days of MR design, it was a challenge for vendors to build a certain amplitude. I think nowadays, we know exactly what to do. We know how to design, we know how to interact, and actually it's almost like a choice against, for example, costs and how strong your gradients you want to have. But what is often forgotten is that when you talk about amplitude and slew rate, it's not just the amplitude and slew rate you want to think about, but also when you put in all this power, you want to make sure that other things that we sort of refer to as the accuracy part, that linearity, the fidelity, but also the endurance part, which is the GRMS, stay in tune. And to explain it a little bit in a simple way, I think linearity speaks for itself. You want to make use of your entire field of view. I mean, if you claim to have a 55 centimeter field of view, you want to be able to image that wrist also on the side of the body instead of putting the poor patient into a Superman position. So linearity is a simple but an important starting point for any gradient design. Now, when it comes to fidelity, fidelity is a little bit of a new term, but that we have introduced with the lesion. It's a true parameter, it's a KPI, it's a measured element, but it basically refers to how close is your gradient waveform to the waveform you really want to have. Because the two can differ. You know, if you would have a, let's say, a bad system, then the waveform that comes out is not as good as you want it to be, and of course that's the starting point of not good image quality. In short, if you have a high fidelity, then the gradient waveform is very close to the intended waveform. And we can actually measure that, and I'll show you an example in a moment. And the other part is GRMS, and GRMS is basically the better quantification of what we, I would say, formally refer to duty cycle. But GRMS, or gradient root mean square, is basically, you could see as the average gradient across, let's say, a sequence. If you run a sequence of 3 minutes or 5 minutes, or maybe something much more intense like in neuroscience of 10 or 15 minutes, the average gradient that you run says something about the heat dissipation in your, let's say, entire chain. And very often, if you have a design that sort of is suboptimal, the heat dissipation or other components can, let's say, can limit the ability for the system to keep up with that average gradient. To give an example, if you have a diffusion sequence, you have one big pulse typically and a lot of other stuff behind it. But if your system would have an inability to run high gradient, then the system would need to slow down forcibly. The TRs would be extended because otherwise, I don't know, your system might get too hot or something of that nature. So GRMS, our system is able to sustain a GRMS of 27 millitesla per meter. But that's not the amplitude, but that's the average gradient across any sequence that it's able to endure without, let's say, getting too hot or too much energy being dissipated. All right, so basically what I'm saying is amplitude to slew rate are important, but don't forget about the accuracy of your system to be delivered by linearity and fidelity that you can actually quantify, or make sure that the average gradient that the system can endure is covered by a quantified GRMS. Now, on the next slide, just to have one example of accuracy or gradient fidelity. And here we actually see a test situation where we do a spiral all the way up to 45 millitesla per meter, and the 220 slew rate. Now you see these in the middle, this red line and these blue dots. Now the red line is the intended waveform, and the blue dots are the measured gradient results. And they are measured with an independent, what we call scope camera. Basically, a system that you sensor that you put, let's say, in the middle or somewhere in the field of view, so you can actually measure what the gradient waveform is. And you can see there's a small difference between the blue dots and the red line. The difference between the two is what you could call the deviation, what you could say is a deviation from the perfect setup. The difference between the two, therefore, can be inverted by saying, how accurate is it, and that's the fidelity. Now, in this very example, it's a very high fidelity. It's the number, it's 99.997%. It's difficult to pronounce, but our systems have a guaranteed fidelity of 99.97%. And in this very system example, it's clearly meeting that performance indicator. Now, what I'm really saying is, the system is not influenced by eddy currents. And this is a very long story. We can do a whole presentation on that. But typically the reason for not being able to have a high accuracy is related to eddy current behavior. And the gradient design that we have come up with already in 2018, 2019 with the lesion setup is that the fidelity we have is extremely high, allowing us to have the starting point of great image quality. All right, enough about that part. And let's say a few further things about gradients. Because a high endurance, as I already explained, is not just there for the diffusion experiments. High GRMS, or high average gradient, I should say, also plays a role in high spatial resolution. And for those that, I guess, remember some of the MR physics classes, it has to do with something like, gradient surface area under the sequence graph. And the more spatial resolution you want, the higher the surfaces under these gradient sequences needs to be. And you typically see that in diffusion, but also in high resolution imaging. Like, for example, in these MSK cases, this will actually run on an Elysian X. And you see that the average gradient, it's actually put in small print, that the GRMS for the left and right sequence was 22 and 23 millitesla per meter. Again, it is not the peak, this is the average gradient. And so the peak is actually probably quite a bit higher, maybe close to 40 or something. So what you see is that gradient endurance plays a role in many types of image quality. Because we always say that, this is a very high resolution MSK image, that's clear. But I can produce any high spatial resolution as long as you give me enough scan time. So the combination of spatial resolution and scan time, that's always an indicator of what your GRMS is about. If my GRMS of the system would have been a lot lower, I don't know, maybe the system could only endure 15 average, then my scan time would certainly go up to, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And so this is where you see how the combination is, let's say, enabled by a system with a high GRMS or high gradient endurance. And just to emphasize that a little bit further, and we deep dive that in many ways, but if you look at gradient endurance and you look at the different types of sequences that we typically see around, this was measured on a bunch of systems out there in the field. Clearly you see the diffusion experiments, you see a lot of high average gradients, high GRMSs. Although it can be actually quite a bit of a range from low to much higher. But you also see it in the typical high resolution sequences, like the balanced TFVs or the susceptibility weighted imaging approaches. So just to explain how that is indeed combined, this is what you see. And this also allows you to think about, well, what do I need in my next configuration? Now, if you want to have any further deep dive on that, we do have specific white papers to describe everything in detail. And I hope you're still with me, because then we're going to move a little bit more to the actual images. Enough about gradient details. Because when we came up with the Elysian, we also knew that we did want to move to one higher level of gradient amplitudes. There are needs out there, specifically in the area of diffusion imaging, neuroscience, a little bit more in the high-res work, that really require one step further in gradient performance. So from the Elysian X onwards, we moved up to the MR 7700, which moves all the way up to 65 to 20 when it comes to amplitude and slew rate. And what you see in these systems is that it's actually, it really creates the most beautiful diffusion images that we have actually ever created. And I'll hope to convince you on that in a couple of slides. Also, when it comes to neuroscience, I think many of you will be very aware, or maybe even conducting those experiments yourself. Neuroscience has gone through a quite amazing, let's say, road for the last 10 years or so, when the requirements on scanners to run neuroscience have really been increased. Basically, the trials that you see going on, whether that's the bio studies that were done in the UK or the many studies in neuro trials, they put extreme, let's say, demand on what you should do for diffusion or fMRI imaging. And I think this system had one of the design challenges in that area to make sure we could run those experiments. So moving to the next slide in that sense, I think just showing you a couple of examples. Now here you see how, for example, the Elysian X compares to the MR 7700. And what I typically enjoy, and that already I enjoy with the Lesion X configuration, you see that the diffusion image quality is, simply very high. I think maybe 5 years ago, or maybe a bit longer, I don't think we typically would show a B10,000 image. Now, mind you, a B10,000 image is not of any relevance in daily clinical imaging. B10,000 is only relevant in specific neuroscience experiments. But it does prove the point of what it is we're able to do. Now, I do want to highlight one further thing, is that these images come directly out of the scanner. There's no processing done, there's no what you call registration or deformation, and I may not know the exact example of this one, but it's typically 35 directions that we combine into one isotropic diffusion weighted images or something of that nature. But you can see it has a very high accuracy, and it's not blurred because simply the individual images that sort of combine into this one image do not need realignment. And I think that's one of the strong things, that's the high fidelity I refer to. But then when we move from the upper examples to the lower examples, you start to see the decrease in echo time. Of course, because we can run it all the way up to the 65 millitesla per meter. No need to explain that that plays a key role in further pumping up the signal to noise. Now, if you with all respect, if you run only, let's say, standard diffusion imaging, your B1000s for the brain, I don't think the MR 7700 is worth the extra money. I think the Lesion X can be a perfect candidate, and we could even discuss, other configurations. But when you start to look at these higher B values, you start to see that signal to noise is really making a difference. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense because on the B10,000, you see that, I gain about 36 milliseconds in this very example. And that is a lot of signal to noise compared to the T2 that we have, in this case, for white matter. The 35% of signal to noise increase is gauged against white matter. So in that sense, that it's the official, very well validated claim. Now, of course, we have our customers running that on their scanners. And of course, this is let's say, a day-to-day clinical example, pre-surgical metastases in the brain. And what you see is that you can run and get the fiber tracks, but of course, my focus is a little bit on some of the details. This was the 32 directions, and a 2 minutes, just over 2 minute acquisitions. And I think the fact that this high quality in just 2 minutes comes around, that is something that the 7700 can easily do. It just becomes a daily clinical routine protocol. You don't really need to worry about it that much. Another, I think, an example that I really enjoy is simply high-resolution diffusion weighted imaging. This is of the hippocampus. But the beauty of this example is that we combine it here with multi-echo approaches and zoom imaging. In other words, we sort of saturate out everything out of the smaller field of view with specific rest labs, but also we do non-collinear excitation of the 90 and 180 pulse, allowing us to zoom into a small field of view and then do the acquisition and encoding. But I also, I make always the joke, this is not a flare image, this is a real diffusion image. And you can see the granularity, you can see the hippocampus in beautiful high-resolution details. And we see, really a lot of excitement, especially in the eyes of neuroradiologists, being able to get this level of detail in their day-to-day routine imaging. Of course, it doesn't apply only to the brain. The diffusion imaging is applied everywhere. Signal to noise improvements in the liver. You can see, huge steps. As a matter of fact, the T2 of liver being shorter than that of white matter, the signal to noise gain is actually larger than what you see here on the slide. Now, again, it runs everywhere. Diffusion is across the body. We can do prostate imaging. You can actually see that even in these examples, you start to see the delineations of the prostate quite well, whether you see it in the original diffusion weighted images or the ADCs. And basically it runs everywhere. And then if you move a little bit more to the neuroscience field, you actually start to see that, a bit of an example that I showed you before, but the signal-to-noise improvement becomes essential. And I want to make it even stronger. Because typically, the DTIs are only showing these colorful images, and that's great. But if you look at the underlying imaging that is done, if you take a neuroscience experiment, typically, it can be that thousands of images are actually at the base of doing your DTI, your fiber tracking, or your much more advanced neuroscience work. But if you look at the single NSA, a single image, and I've given you an example here, done on the Lesion X and done on the 7700, what you see is the single signal-to-noise improvement from a Lesion X to the 7700. Now, if you multiply this by, let's say, thousands of images, and you realize you don't need to do any realignment procedures for any of your processing, you can understand how your end neuroscientific result will improve when you move from the Lesion X to the MR7700. And I think that's the basis. Typically, people only show the beautiful, colorful examples, as I will do on my next slide. But I think it's important to understand where the data is coming from and how the signal-to-noise is improved, very much at the start of the processing file. And then, of course, you do get to the a whole plethora of types of visualization. And I think the challenge of analyzing crossing fibers or diverging fibers all comes with high quality data input, which I basically showed you on the previous slide. And as I tried to explain, the high quality data input comes very much from the early design choices that we've made already with your lesion. From the lesion with the high gradient fidelity, the high GRMS, and of course the high amplitude to get to a small echo time and high signal to noise. That's what actually brings us to the data quality that we see today. So that was a little bit the key part of the MR7700, but there's a lot more to tell. And I will not have enough time, and I probably will go over my time slot already, but when you think about designing an MR, it's not just about gradients or RF. It's a lot about other things. And I have a limited time to talk about any of those, but let's put it just like that. There is one part, and that is the whole workflow. And I will show a couple of slides on how our centric workflow, for those that are not acquainted with Philips MR systems, is organized. Now, in this slide, it shows you all the details, but I will only highlight a couple of things. Now, on the upper part, you see the workflow that we have done or allow technologists to run in the examination room, with the patient being correctly informed with the vitalized screen, automated startup of scanning, etc. And the control room allowing us to help the operator, not just with scanning and organizing, but actually automating it to a large extent, enabling some of the work that hopefully is too repetitive in nature and does not necessarily require the knowledge or the value that the technology brings to the table. And just to highlight a couple of the new things, I think the patient setup is something that we are rather proud of. Here you see an animation of how vital screen and how vital eye, which is the sensor at the back of the scanner, automatically detects how breathing is done by the patient. There's no need for the operator to put a belt or anything else. It's always there, and it always allows the operator to use the breathing pattern to a very high accuracy level at all times without requiring any setup time. Another, I would say, Philips' unique approach is how we deal with implants. Now, that might be something that you have not thought about today, but the average age of our patients in scanners is rising. And whether a patient comes from, for a certain type of scanning, it can be that another part of the body is already has some form of implant. And many implants nowadays are compatible with MR scanning, both 1.5 and 3T. The question for the technologist is, well, I know the details of the implants, but how do I make sure that the scanner will never supersede any of those parameters for which the implant has as a prerequisite? And what we call MR conditional implants makes sure that once you register the patient and you say during the registration, this patient cannot, sorry, not this patient, but due to the implant, the patient should not endure, let's say, a higher slew rate than 100 Tesla per meter per second, you can put that into the scanner, during scanner, whether it is gradient related, whether it's RF related, and the scanner will therefore ensure afterwards that the scanner will never pass those red lines, allowing the operator to be safe that it is correctly treated with respect to the implants of the given patient. And I think providing that level of confidence, I think, is essential. And actually it will soon become the standard by regulation-wise. Now we have a lot of things to say as we're going to move and change our user interface. There's too much to say about this, and as the clock is ticking way too quickly, I will move on a little bit further on. But it will allow us to plan ahead and even easily organize patient details or processing afterwards. Now, already discussed a little bit yesterday was the abilities that we have with reconstructions. And again, there's so much to say, but hopefully you find your way to follow up in any other details later on with your local fidelity representatives. But the acceleration we have in MR is highly related to compressed sense, which is basically our ability to save on case space. We all know that the amount of case space we need to cover is proportional to the time that we need to scan. So if we can reduce the amount of case space acquisition needs, which we do by compressed sense, we can save time. That's the speed machine. But of course, the less case space you require, the smarter you need to be on the reconstruction side. And we used to have sense and compressed sense. And with AI being included, we've now moved to what we call the adaptive compressed sense net. And again, this is very complicated. There's a lot of things, and I'm going to not fully explain that on that right now. But what we do see is beautiful results. And the beauty about our way to bring AI into reconstruction, and it applies everywhere, 2D, 3D. You see, for example, in in-person recovery reconstruction approach, we see beautiful increases in resolution. We see beautiful maintenance of high-level details. And for example, whether it applies with diffusion or, as I just showed, inverse recovery, we can do all of the above. And of course, it applies to any body part, 2D, 3D. We see all kinds of new approaches to applying it to 3D emerging, allowing us to really get to isotropic work, as you can see in this 0.2 lumbar spine example. Some of the examples we get back are simply stunning. This is from a customer in Australia running our new approach to reconstruction with smart speed in a beautiful way, seeing the brachial plexus, and I'm not even 100% sure whether this is some form of extent of the brachial plexus, but at least in the shoulder, seeing nerves circle around, being able to help the radiologist with the right diagnosis. Now, I'm going to, I really am at high speed right now, so I'm looking forward to questions still. But there's a few things I want to still hopefully entice you with. MR vendors over the years have acquired so much knowledge, all based on proton, on how to optimize, increase, make better, that we sometimes forgot about the fact that protons and water associated with that only provides us with limited information when it comes to physiology, metabolics in general, and there's all these other nuclei which can bring us a different horizon when it comes to insights. And so the challenge with multinuclei has always been twofold. The first being it's low in signal to noise, which we understand, and not easy to solve. And the second one is workflow. Typically, your multinuclei abilities on your system requires like 3 physicists, a makeover of your system, and it completely disrupts your workflow. Now this part, this latter part, the workflow part, that we have solved. And actually multinuclear can be as simple as an integrated experiment. We have seamless integration of coils, image acquisition, reconstruction, viewing. It's just the same as proton. It doesn't make any difference anymore. And we're actually very proud of it because we know how difficult it is from a technical perspective to do this. And I will not get into the details, but we've covered the job. We can do 5 different nuclei apart from proton with the same user interface. And really, the nucleus for us is just a parameter. And because it's just a parameter, we can actually combine it with all the imaging that we do, any sequence, like whether that is, I don't know, field echo or a balanced approach or EPIs, etc. All is combinable, or all the spectroscopic events, whether that's 1D, 2D CSI, or single voxel work. The nucleus is really just a parameter in the interface. Now the beauty of it is that with, for example, here with this dual-tuned head coil, which does proton and sodium in this case, we could do all the proton imaging and the sodium imaging in a 27-minute exam card. But notice a couple of things. It's just one exam card. And within that one exam card, the scanner does both proton and the sodium. And it's just one coil. So in a way, there's nothing different from operating this example versus, let's say, what it is you do on a daily basis. So if you're interested in stroke imaging with sodium, or maybe in a cancerous situation in a glioblastoma multiforme, and you want to combine that with sodium, as we see now with some customers, it is just the additional, in this case, 14 minutes of the sodium. But the workflow is the same. So you don't lose on the workflow, and you can think about integrating that with your normal day-to-day patient progress. And, you know, like I said, it's just a sequence. You know, it's just a parameter in your sequence, whether you do 1D CSI, for example, in the sort of middle example, you see left and right 1D CSI example, so you can compare left to right hemispheres, in this case of phosphorus or single voxel. For us, it is just a parameter, and it's up to you to choose. We have flex and dual-tuned coils available for sodium, carbon, and phosphorus, and with that, you don't need a research contract. A disclaimer there would be that if you want to do other coils, then you will need to talk about research coils being able to connect. But for sodium, carbon, and phosphorus, we have 2 coils available, integrated and running from day one. So moving to the lens, last example here is we have this flex coil, which is a multi-purpose coil that we call. We can run that basically anywhere in the body. While this may not be the optimal situation for sodium imaging in cartilage of the knee, it still actually is a very simple example, because if you want to look at glycosaminoglycans, which is a component in cartilage that you cannot see with proton, even this coil allows you to do that type of imaging. And you know, you can use that same flex coil in other examples, in this case liver, a carbon example. So one of the final slides, when it comes to multinuclear imaging, of course proton is there. The 5 additional multinuclei, we've seen examples across the entire body, and this is all integrated and this is all product. And I think we are extremely proud of being able to offer this, even though we do realize that this is not for every clinician a very interesting topic. So we hope to show you a lot more in the coming year, or maybe 2 years, as to how clinical possibilities will evolve. Because speed with proton is important, image quality is very important, but I think the ability to explore beyond proton is in some way really interesting, and hopefully entices you to think about other ways in imaging. I want to keep it to that. I hope I've explained that it's about unmatched performance and precision. Unmatched performance, whether that's gradient design, workflow, but even thinking about multinuclear and the future diagnostic precision that can provide.